Hi everyone, welcome to another G News update. Well, yesterday represented a kind of a turning point in New Zealand politics, as I think most of the country came to the same conclusion that this government really has to go. And there was a bit of a desperate press Hi everyone, welcome to another G News. Hi everyone, welcome to another G News update. Well, yesterday there was a bit of a desperate post-cab presser, and through that press conference there was a lot of strange language used, and I think it represented a kind of a turning point in New Zealand politics after about 18 or 19 months of this new government, this coalition. I think most New Zealanders had come to the point where they realised that this really wasn't working and that they weren't hearing a fair assessment of how things really are. And we had the Prime Minister and the Minister of Finance kind of dancing on the head of a pin and presenting quite a lot of dubious comment, which Chris Hipkins had described as more spin than a front-loaded washing machine. And I tended to agree with him. Bernard Hickey also said similar things this morning on the Kaka in his analysis. And he looked at some of the language that was used, and one of them was this: the immutable laws of economics.
How did we get here? As I keep saying, we've had to come back to the immutable laws of economics. If you lose control of spending, you lose control of inflation, you lose control on interest rates, put an economy into recession and people start losing their jobs. It's a known economic prescription that we know how that works. And the previous government stuffed that, they crashed that, and as a result, people are feeling that pain and suffering now. And so our job, 18 months into a new government, is to make sure we're doing everything we can to deliver for New Zealanders, because that's the thing that they are most fixated on and care about the most.
Bernard said that not many economists actually use language that is that black and white about economics. So it's pretty rare to find people that are kind of that fundamentalist. It's quite true that not many economists actually are that fundamentalist about the immutable laws of economics. And so it's a very rare thing for any economist to actually cling to. It's also a bit of a shallow take, and I think what we're seeing here is somebody that doesn't really know very much in the Prime Minister, just reciting stuff that, like a bullet point that he's learned. And his take doesn't really tell New Zealanders the real story about what has happened. So we also saw the Prime Minister continuing to play a blame game that wasn't really very honest with New Zealanders about the causes of inflation and bringing inflation down, just using a couple of data points and kind of shifting everything onto the previous government, when you and I know that inflation went up in the UK to over 10%. It went up in the United States to around about 9%. Inflation went up in Australia to 8%. And for just about all of Europe, things were worse, really, than they were in New Zealand when it came to inflation. But we've got the Finance Minister and the Prime Minister trying to solely isolate New Zealand and its inflation of 7.3% down to 2.3%, and taking the credit for all of the deflation of inflation over that period, which isn't true either. Christopher Luxon went on to kind of describe all political parties that disagreed with him as being in favour of all sorts of handouts, which was a very old school Republican way of talking about supporting people that need it in our society. And what else? He was talking about borrowing and wasteful spending.
Now, other parties in Parliament believe that raising taxes, growing the public sector and giving more handouts to those who refuse to work is the answer. Spending more, taxing more and borrowing more, as Labour and others advocate for, didn't work in the past and it won't work in the future. While inflation is down to 2.7% from the highs of 7.3% under Labour, the reality is that Kiwis are still trying to catch up after years of increases fuelled by Labour's wasteful spending and borrowing.
Wasteful spending on things like, wage subsidies that just about all of his voter base actually accepted during the pandemic, and of course wasteful spending on things like climate change, because his government had taken that money out of the climate emissions reduction funds, and we also don't have a national resilience fund. We had $6 billion there, and that was all wasteful spending, so it had been reprioritised. But now we've got all these people facing floods, and I think those people who have seen themselves ruined or put into a situation where, life is really hard now, those in poverty, those who are out of work, they're all looking at this now and they're going, well, this guy, he's not telling us, really what's going on. He's just blithering. So this was spin. We saw an announcement yesterday about this surcharges business with Scott Simpson. Here's what the Prime Minister had to say. And the Finance Minister.
And a new measure announced today will ensure that Kiwis, the price Kiwis see on the price tag is the same one that they pay at the checkout. Commerce and Consumer Affairs Minister Scott Simpson has announced that the government will ban in-store credit and debit card surcharges like paywave fee.
That surcharge change, the surcharge ban you just referenced, could actually be inflationary as those retailers pass on the costs through increased prices.
Well, I'll let Nicola talk to that because it's important to understand what's happened with the Commerce Commission ruling and then also the banning of surcharges that we've announced today as well.
So there's been two changes. Last week, the Commerce Commission came out with their decision to regulate the price that Visa, MasterCard and others can charge retailers for their services, and they've reduced those costs significantly. They estimate the cost saving for an average small business is around $500 a year. They've taken tens of millions out. Our concern is how do you make sure that's passed through to the consumer, to the shopper, that it's not just absorbed by the retailers.
But this morning on TVNZ, Caroline Young from the Retail New Zealand Association had this to say, that most New Zealand businesses were telling her that they're going to put the prices up. So this is a very inflationary move.
From a small business perspective, we've had a lot of feedback from our members who are pretty unhappy with the decision. It's a really difficult trading environment for a small business where they don't have the ability to negotiate fees with banks, with landlords, with insurance companies, with rates, any of those sorts of things, and we're seeing significant increases in all of those costs, squeezing margin, and we're still seeing plenty of businesses close. The businesses we've spoken to yesterday after the announcement have certainly indicated they would be looking at increasing prices to cover the costs.
Not only is it an inflationary move, but it's really late. And it's not as if the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister are actually moving at haste here when it comes to the overall implementation, which is not due until May next year.
Just on that, the surcharge plans, can you explain why that's coming into force in May next year? I mean, how is that doing all you can if it's taking...
So we are, that's just following the legislative process that we have today. As you well know, we go through a first reading, second reading, committee of the whole, third reading, then...
We're actually not seeing anything happening quickly here, but we are seeing the decision making and the announcements made in haste without consultation. So there's a hope that what will happen is the National Party will actually consult people.
Sorry,
the Restaurant Association has just put out a response to the tap and pay. They say it comes as a surprise. Have you done an appropriate amount of consultation with industry on these changes?
Well, to the question earlier, we have moved promptly. Last week when the Commerce Commission came out with their ruling, they estimated that would save small businesses around $90 billion a year.
And whether it's a good idea will actually shake out of the rush, which I think is quite a desperate rush. Thomas Coughlin was saying, well, you've spent about 10 minutes trying to tell us a one-sided story here about your economic performance. Are you desperate about the costs of living? And, of course, the Prime Minister dismissed all such concerns, suggesting that even the Ipsos poll that says Labour are a better place to handle the costs of living than National, he would be highly sceptical that that was actually true. So hard data, he's undermining that again. When it came to inflation, the whole topic of 7.3 was repeated a lot by the Finance Minister.
Under the previous government, prices rose very rapidly, with annual inflation reaching 7.3%, the highest level since 1990.
But as you can see here, Bill Casely actually points out that Labour had reduced inflation by more than the National Party have. So it's really the case that the Labour Party are the superior economic managers who had managed brilliantly through COVID, kept our inflation down below that of the UK or the United States or even Australia, and had actually brought it down more than all of this cost cutting and austerity and the hijacking of construction as If you look at the budgets, National stopped building houses round about now. They called it a fiscal cliff, and they weren't prepared to keep investing in building state houses. So we're actually seeing the consequences of that in the figures, all the people that are out of work. There's 28,000 people out of work, of which about 12,000 are in construction. Christopher Luxon agreed that this area, this sector, had been mostly impacted because it has to borrow and interest rates are sensitive in the sector. But he took no responsibility for his government's action, stalling the building of houses, stalling the building of transport projects, and underfunding and scaling back hospital bills, which have left so many people out of work and so many leaving the country. Nicola Willis was kind of in excuse-making mode, trying to say that the economy was kind of like an oil tanker and it takes a long time to turn it around. So I think she was stalling for time here.
Economies are like oil tankers. You can't turn them around on a dime.
And I think most people were a little bit shocked that this government under Nicola Willis and under Christopher Luxon had recently presided over the offer to teachers of only 1% pay increases, whilst at the same time offering up to 80% pay increases for the directors of Crown entities. So the gap between 1% and 80% kind of spoke a lot about the values of the National Party, and it tried to excuse this by saying, well, we want to attract people to these roles, like in the Health NZ board, but it was added that their job is to cut, to make savings, to reduce the services. Here's Christopher Luxon.
Yeah, look, historically what's happened is that the public sector director fees have got completely out of whack compared to private sector fees. Obviously, we will never pay as much as someone in the private sector, but when you're spending $32 billion on healthcare, for example, it's important that we actually are able to attract really good governors of say, the Health New Zealand board, for example. So we need to make sure that we've got a competitive enough offering to be able to attract good people that we know can make a huge difference and can actually generate huge value for money and savings as a consequence.
Claudette brought up the fact that there'd been a count of about 6,000 tamariki who were living below the breadline and who weren't actually enjoying this great cost of living, boasting fantastic back on track that Christopher Luxon was making out was happening. But he tried to blow her off again.
On that question thread, though, Prime Minister, Kai Āwhina in Ngāmotu in New Plymouth found a kuia and her mokopuna in a freedom camping site, and advocates in Te Taitukoro have counted 6,000 tamariki living beneath the breadline in freezing conditions, jammed into sheds. So given what you've just said, how is it that you can allow that to happen, and also talk about the policies that are affecting whānau?
Well,
this is the human face.
Sure, and we're working, we understand we've got some real challenges in our housing market. That's why we're trying to make it easier to build more houses so that more people can be accommodated in safe, dry, affordable homes. That's why you're seeing us actually do everything we can to make sure that rents are not going up. We've got stable rents in New Zealand for the first time in a long time. That's why you've seen us take 6,000 people off the State House wait list. That's how we've moved 2,100 kids out of emergency housing into proper homes, because we've prioritised them above others to get them into state houses and community houses. So we know it's still challenging. Sorry?
Advocacy reports like the Homelessness Insights report contradict what you're saying.
No, we know we've got real challenges in homelessness.
And he said we're doing all we can, but obviously whatever he's doing hasn't been working because so many people are living in freezing conditions, like shacked into sheds. This is what's going on. Mikey Sherman brought up the fact that Christopher Luxon had been roundly booed at the netball, and this was quite unusual, I think, for any politician to be booed that publicly, and it made all of the major media organisation headlines yesterday, because a Prime Minister being booed is quite a rare event. So what did Christopher Luxon do? Well, of course, he tried to make out that it was very common and it wasn't unusual.
More houses built.
You were booed at the netball finals yesterday. Why do you think that was?
Oh, look, it's not uncommon for politicians to be booed at some events, but I just say I was treated really well. People were very, very nice to me at that event, and they often are across the whole of the country.
There was an attempt to sell the idea that tax reforms under Nicola Willis had really helped people on lower incomes, and people with children really enjoyed the benefits.
But I think if you were to ask most families whether they would miss that money right now, they certainly would.
The truth of the matter was that both of these were areas where there'd been very little done to help people who are kind of around the minimum wage, for example, who had the greatest need for some kind of tax relief, got $2.50 a week. So that was pretty shocking, and those on higher incomes got more than they did, and they had less of a need. So this was kind of not proportionate, and it was unfair, and it was the kind of thing you get. But it wasn't covered really by Christopher Luxon or Nicola Willis as they tried to sell how great they were to the public, which was very un-Kiwi really, because they're not really telling us the full truth, are they?
In your list of cost of living initiatives, I noticed you didn't mention the scrapping of discounts to public transport or prescription fees, the reversal of the free ECE for 2-year-olds, the hiking of car registration costs. Are you giving New Zealanders a fair picture of the government's response to cost of living?
Yeah, look, I mean, I acknowledge there are things like in some of those fees and charges that have been built up over a period of time.
28,000 people had lost their jobs, and a good number of them have gone overseas, which is something that the government has just blown off as something that was going to happen.
Sorry?
28,000 fewer jobs in the year to June. The biggest sector taking a hit is construction. Labor's saying we're in a construction crisis, something similar to that. What's your response?
Yeah, look, I mean, there's no doubt about it. Construction is the industry that I think has been hit the hardest through the economic challenges that we've experienced in the last 3 years.
And try to blame the previous government for all of that. But we can see all the cuts that they've been making to the public service. We can see all of the stalling effects of construction and how that's impacted that sector, because they've stalled the economy, they've broken the economy, they've extended recession, and now New Zealand is going backwards. All the lead indicators suggest that we're back in recession already under Nicola Willis and her settings, which are about cutting and stalling and not growing anything. The topic of cataracts and how the big hiring freeze and the way in which the government had basically taken a 5-year integration of all of the DHBs and driven it off the road by getting rid of the board and putting Leicester in place and making up stuff about 14 layers of management, with the patient being one of those layers. That came up yesterday when it came to comments that Christopher Luxon had made that we've got this great new Minister of Health and cataracts have been standardised.
On breakfast this morning you said whether you're in Whangarei or Southland, it's one national threshold for cataract surgery. But that's not true. In Southland, 61 points are still needed. Are you aware of that?
Yeah, what I was trying to communicate was the fact that we had 20 DHBs. They were smashed together in a very botched restructure and made into a body called Health New Zealand. Essentially, those 20 DHBs continued with about 2,500 managers over the top of them, and we didn't end up with a centralised healthcare system that could actually make sure we had clear thresholds and criteria up and down the country that were truly national. And so there is postcode lottery going on, and that's what the Minister and I have both been very alive to. What he is doing, and is just in the process of doing, is to making sure, for example, for cataracts, that is going to be a nationalised standard and threshold.
Now, as I mentioned yesterday, this was a Labour initiative back in July 2023, and it had been called for a long time. But as we can see, it's not the case. It's not the case yet, anyway, that we have a standard. And worse, you have to go partially blind before anything's going to happen. And this promise was made 2 years ago, so it's not like these people in government right now are getting things done or moving quickly like they claim. In fact, it's the opposite, isn't it? They're dragging their heels.
Then, if I just go back to it, in Southland, that score of 61 means some patients have to be going partially blind before they get surgery. When will this change be announced, as was promised 2 years ago?
Well, as I said to you, what Simeon Brown's doing as Minister of Health is making sure that Health New Zealand ultimately functions as a national, countrywide health body.
As you recall, the gerrymandering of the electoral system had just been kind of thrown into place with Paul Goldsmith. And yesterday at the post-cab presser, this came up, and Laura Walters from Newsroom was asking about, was there an alternative? Could you have actually explored, giving the electoral system a little bit more resources? Could you have done something else? Did you do any research? And Christopher Luxon was caught, like a possum in the headlamps, and he basically said, well, you'll have to talk to the minister, but we're thinking of doing something around the board level at the Electoral Commission. Then that was a non-answer, and that was a big fail. So the answer is no. This is a desperate knee-jerk reaction to try and gerrymander our voting system.
Advice at all on whether there was a way to make sure that that period after the election day didn't blow out further, that where you could, return those results in a shorter period of time without making these changes? Did you consider, for example, further resourcing to the Electoral Commission or anything along those lines?
Look, that's a decision for the Minister working with an independent Electoral Commission. Obviously, there's a new chair there. One of the recommendations is we want to expand the board from 3 up to 7 people on that board, and that's a decision that they get to make.
Lastly, when it came to the post-cab presser, there was reference to the way that Christopher Luxon may have actually not gone to Hawaii for his holiday, but spent his holiday in Scotland, having a luxury of a time, actually doing things like playing golf. But Luxon didn't want to talk about how he'd been goofing off and playing golf in a cost of living crisis, because that would look too truthful and too honest. So he said he was too busy to be talking about what he'd actually just done and taken a whole week off, as you recall recently.
Conversations in that regard.
President Trump is on a holiday in Scotland golfing. How's the golfing here in New Zealand?
Look, mate, I've got a lot on my plate, and I'm not focused on leisure. I'm focused on getting this job done for New Zealanders. Last question to you.
So finally, in this G News update, I just want to talk about 2 other things. One of them is that in the news this morning, we've seen that the New Zealand First, Casey Costello, has presided over an extension of the big subsidising of heated tobacco products for Philip Morris. This was meant to last for 1 year. But we found out from Guyon this morning that this had been extended for 2 more years without even talking to anyone. So this 1-year trial was now going to mean that Big Tobacco got 3 years of half-price tax. So the tax or the excise had been cut in half by New Zealand First in order to promote, I think, lung cancer for more New Zealanders and early deaths, this kind of thing. So that's one big piece of news about how this government is really bad for New Zealanders. And the second thing is that on Wednesday, about 36,000 nurses will go on strike because it's become unsafe under Simeon Brown and Christopher Luxon and Nicola Willis for them to actually go to work. The patient safety is just a problem. They're not being resourced. They're not being listened to, and all this spin about a record investment in health is bringing on industrial action, strikes, and the trusted people in our lives, the doctors, the nurses, the surgeons, all singing out and trying to tell the public, look at what's happening. Your public health system is being pulled apart by Christopher Luxon's government. So that's all I want to say today. Have a good afternoon, and I'll be back with highlights from New Zealand's Parliament later on in the day. See you all later.
Welcome to G News, the good news.
Yeah.